Wide receivers are the Wild West at the halfway mark of the season, and this week Puka is expected back, Rashee Rice is rolling, and new names keep breaking inside the top 30. Let's break down who you can actually count on in Week 9. What's up, Headliner Nation? My name is Brad, the Rankings King, and before we dive into this week's rankings, just a reminder that these are the consensus rankings from the Headliners team. And for more detailed analysis, check out the start-sit videos already posted on the channel this week. If you want even more breakdowns each week, join the Fantasy Headliners community by hitting that join button below. That's going to get you access to extra rankings like flex, kicker, defense, and a spot inside of our Discord. Now, before we jump into Week 9, we've got a few hits and misses from week number 8. First hit is Rashee Rice, and we thought it was kind of bold to rank him as the wide receiver 5 on the week, and then he went out and finished as the wide receiver 2, but having him in tier 1 paid off. Our next hit is DK Metcalf, and we knew that Rodgers would need him to try and beat his former team, and luckily he was saved with a touchdown, and he finished at wide receiver 12, which is right where we had him ranked. Our next hit is George Pickens, and I wonder where all of the over-emotional comment bros are at that told us how dumb we were to rank Pickens at wide receiver 23 last week, because let me look, he finished at wide receiver 23. So there you go. There's your hits. Now let's look at a couple of our misses, and we'll start with Khalil Shakir. And in an offense that can beat you so many ways, it's hard to pick whose week it's going to be. We had Shakir inside of the top 30, but he finished way higher. Our next miss is Ladd McConkey, and similar to Shakir, there are so many options to choose from in LA. We had Keenan way higher, but it was a Ladd McConkey week. And our next miss was Kayshon Boutte. And listen, nobody talks about the Boutte more than us. He made the rankings last week, but he's so reliant on touchdowns, it's hard to put him anywhere but tier 4. But dude, he outperformed even that. All right, so there you go. There's your hits and misses. Let's turn the page to week 9, and we'll start in tier 1. We've got Puka Nacua, Jaxon Smith-Njigba, CeeDee Lamb, Amon-Ra St. Brown, Rashee Rice, Ja'Marr Chase, and Rome Odunze. At number 1, we have Puka Nacua, and the Puka return is expected this week, and given the fact that he's had 65 targets in basically only 5 games, puts him right back at the top of the rankings in tier 1 regardless of the matchup, even though this isn't a bad one. At number 2, we have Jaxon Smith-Njigba, and to sum up how great of a season JSN is having, he just had his bye week, and he only trails Ja'Marr Chase by 5 points, who hasn't had his bye week yet. Washington also allows the 9th most fantasy points per game to the wide receiver position. At 3, we've got CeeDee Lamb, and after a tough defensive matchup last week against Denver, CeeDee managed to keep his streak going where he's now had at least 11 fantasy points in every game he's played fully this season. The matchup this week against Arizona is going to be much better. At number 4, we've got Amon-Ra St. Brown coming off of the bye, and in 5 of his last 7 games this season, it's resulted in at least 17 fantasy points. With JMO and Laporta not getting consistent volume, there's no reason to think that Amon-Ra can't do to Minnesota what Ladd McConkey did last week. At number 5, we've got Rashee Rice going into Buffalo, and in just 2 games, he has 18 total touches for almost 150 total yards and 3 touchdowns. You have to think that those numbers would be even higher if both of those games weren't a blowout as well. I expect to see a lot of him in a matchup against Buffalo. At number 6, we have Ja'Marr Chase, and over the last 3 weeks with Flacco, he has 54 targets and 38 receptions. He's back to being the overall wide receiver 1, and he gets a great matchup this week against Chicago. But Flacco is questionable to play right now, and that would be a huge hit to Ja'Marr Chase. At 7, we've got Rome Odunze, and the targets returned, and so did the production for Rome in week 8. Now he gets a great matchup this week going up against Cincinnati, where he should have plenty of opportunities to find the end zone once again. All right, so that's it for tier 1. And before we head into the next tier, I want to make sure that you're all hooked up on Underdog. You already know that we're crushing those player pick'ems on Underdog this year, so what are you waiting for? Head over to Underdog Fantasy or download the app. Create a new account using the referral code HEADLINERS when you do so. Then just make your initial deposit and come join a contest. If you sign up with that promo code, again, it's HEADLINERS, you'll get access to all of the promos that Underdog offers weekly. And check check this out. You play your first $5, they're going to give you $100 in bonus funds. So you play 5, you get 100. It's that easy. And don't forget that Jake is also going to be breaking down the best picks weekly in our show on Fridays. Links to join are in the description, and we look forward to playing with you this week. All right, let's look at Tier 2. We have Justin Jefferson, Davante Adams, Michael Pittman Jr., Nico Collins, George Pickens, DK Metcalf, Ladd McConkey, Zay Flowers, Drake London, and Jalen Waddle. Coming in at number 8, let's look at Justin Jefferson. And there is some concern for Jefferson right now. Wentz is done for the year, and magically McCarthy is good to go. Jefferson averaged almost 11 fantasy points the first 2 weeks of the season with JJ, which isn't bad, but it's not Tier 1 either. At number 9, we've got Davante Adams, and it feels like Adams dominated while Puka was out, but in his last 2 games, he didn't have more than 40 yards in each game. 2 weeks ago, he benefited from 3 one-yard touchdowns. His production was actually better with Puka in the lineup. At number 10, we have Michael Pittman Jr., and it's still crazy to see the Colts be one of the top offenses in the NFL, but Pittman has scored at least 12 fantasy points in 5 of his last 6 games, and now he gets a matchup against Pittsburgh, who allows over 31 fantasy points per game to the wide receiver position. At number 11, we've got Nico Collins, and last week he missed a game due to the old watermelon protocol, and this week he gets a difficult matchup against Denver. However, Patrick Surtain is doubtful to play. That is a huge boost to Nico this week. At number 12, we have George Pickens, and tough matchups, easy matchups with CD, without CD. At this point, Pickens is continuing to put up double-digit fantasy points each game. This matchup this week against Arizona will be even easier than the one last week against Denver. At number 13, we've got DK Metcalf, and DK has only gone over 85 yards twice this year, but he has touchdowns in 5 of 7 games. Luckily, the Colts allow the 4th most fantasy points per game to receivers because most of their opponents are trying to play catch up. At number 14, we've got Ladd McConkey, and who out there is enjoying playing a weekly whack-a-mole trying to figure out which Chargers wide receiver is going to produce? We're sticking with McConkey this week since he's seen 25 targets over the last 2 games. We'll chase the volume. At 15, we've got Zay Flowers, and the volume hasn't been bad for the most part. Neither has the yardage. He just hasn't had a touchdown since week 1. Hopefully with Lamar returning and a matchup against Miami, he has that chance this week. At number 16, we've got Drake London, and at this point, we don't know how healthy London or Penix is. Atlanta is one of the worst teams in the NFL with disclosing injury information. The matchup isn't horrible, but due to all the unknowns, we had to drop him a few spots. At number 17, we have Jalen Waddle, and you just never know which Dolphins offense is going to show up. Personally, I'm voting for another week of one-eyed Tua. If somebody else needs to fart in his pillow to get another great week for Jalen Waddle, I say we do it. All right, that's it for Tier 2. Let's look at Tier 3. We have Brian Thomas Jr., Marvin Harrison Jr., Chris Olave, Cortland Sutton, T. Higgins, Jordan Addison, Ted McMillan, Travis Hunter, Keenan Allen, and Stephon Diggs. At number 18, we start with Brian Thomas Jr., and coming off the bye, but he's also dealing with a shoulder injury. At the time of this recording, he's questionable to play. The matchup against Vegas is great, but if he's playing hurt, that's a huge red flag considering how he's played this season. At number 19, we have Marvin Harrison Jr., and he's also coming off of the bye, but Kyler Murray is still questionable to play. We don't want to rely on Brissett's 50-50 balls down the sideline for all of Mar's production, though, but at least the matchup is good because no team allows more points to wide receivers than the Dallas Cowboys. At number 20, we've got Chris Olave, and the Saints have turned to Tyler Shough at quarterback, but they still will be losing weekly, and that means that they're going to be throwing a ton. Olave's had at least 10 targets in all but 2 games this season, and that should continue even in a tough matchup like this one. At 21, we've got Cortland Sutton, and over the last 3 weeks, Sutton has been a headache. With guys like Mims and Franklin, it's just killing his consistent ceiling. Now, he unfortunately gets one of the most difficult matchups in the NFL against the Houston Texans and Derek Stingley. At number 22, we have T. Higgins, and not a lot of volume last week, but a 44-yard touchdown will save a fantasy day. The biggest question here is the availability of Joe Flacco. He's currently questionable to play, and if since he has to go back to Jake Browning, Higgins will fall down in the ranks. At 23, we have Jordan Addison going to Detroit, and all of the talk this offseason was about how great the chemistry was between McCarthy and Addison. We're going to see if it comes to fruition. This is going to be a tough matchup, but it wouldn't surprise me if he led the team in receiving this week. At number 24, we have Ted McMillan, and Bryce Young is still questionable, and if we get another week of Andy Dalton, we won't complain. Last week was only the second game of the season where Ted saw 10-plus targets. He could definitely use that volume again this week in Green Bay. At number 25, we have Travis Hunter, and rumors have been swirling of Travis Hunter getting more opportunities in the coming weeks. And with Brian Thomas Jr. currently questionable to play and a great matchup this week against Vegas, who allows the third most fantasy points per game to wide receivers, we like Travis Hunter here in Tier 3. At 26, we've got Keenan Allen, and the volume has become more inconsistent for Keenan over the last couple of weeks. He literally went from 14 targets to 5 targets over the span of a week, and that's going to make him a boom or bust play even in a decent matchup against Tennessee. At 27, we have Stephon Diggs, and ever since he went out and dominated Buffalo 4 weeks ago, he's been averaging less than 10 yards per reception. Given the fact that he's had only 3 receptions in 2 of his last 3 games, it makes his floor pretty low and hard to rank him higher. All right, that's it for Tier 3. Now let's look at Tier 4. We've got Khalil Shakir, Quentin Johnston, Wan'Dale Robinson, Troy Franklin, Josh Downs, Trey Tucker, Kayshon Boutte, Xavier Worthy, and Deebo Samuel. At 28, we have Khalil Shakir, and Shakir remains the safest wide receiver weekly in Buffalo. With Josh Palmer questionable to play once again, Shakir will be needed to keep the chains moving in a matchup this week against the Kansas City Chiefs. At number 29, we have Quentin Johnston, and is his time to shine over now? I mean, that's highly doubtful, but the fact that he went through an entire game with 0 targets is a huge red flag. With the emergence of Oronde Gadsden, we could see Johnston becoming more of a boom or bust option. At 30, we've got Wan'Dale Robinson, and offensive weapons keep getting hurt in New York, and Robinson has scored at least 12 fantasy points in 2 of his last 3 games. With Scatterboo getting hurt, maybe we see Wan'Dale as more of a shorter check down option in the coming weeks. At 31, we have Troy Franklin going to Houston, and with Derek Stingley more than likely locking down Courtland Sutton, we could see added targets going the way of Franklin in Week 9. He's already racked up 18 targets and 3 touchdowns over the last 2 weeks. At 32, we have Josh Downs, and he may not be seeing huge volume, but we always want to try and find those players that are getting opportunities in the best offenses in football. Right now, the Colts are one of those offenses, and Downs has touchdowns in back-to-back games. At 33, we have Trey Tucker, and there's not a lot of touchdowns to go around in this Vegas offense. We also know that they just added Tyler Lockett, and we should have Brock Bowers back this week. With some defensive attention looking elsewhere in a good matchup, maybe Tucker can break the big one. At number 34, we have Kayshon Boutte, and Boutte has now had 4 touchdowns over his last 3 games played. He's another one of those guys that doesn't see huge volume, but he's averaging over 20 yards per reception over the last 3 weeks, and one big play can give us a solid fantasy day. At 35, we have Xavier Worthy, and since the return of Rice, he has a combined total of 101 yards and 0 touchdowns. Unfortunately, with Rice soaking up the volume, Worthy will remain a gadget-style, big play-dependent wide receiver regardless of the matchup. At 36, we've got Deebo Samuel, and Deebo has less than 20 yards receiving in back-to-back games. There's a good chance of the Seattle offense getting a lead early, which would force Washington to throw for all 4 quarters. Okay, so there's your top 36 in tiers 1, 2, 3, and 4. And we've got a couple of guys on the outside looking in with Jameson Williams, DJ Moore, Romeo Doubs, Rashid Shaheed, Jawan Jennings, Alec Pierce, and Kendrick Bourne. So there you go. That wraps up your Week 9 wide receiver rankings. Drop your biggest start-sit question in the comments and let us know who are you rolling with this week and who is riding the bench. Be sure to like the video and subscribe so you don't miss any of the rankings videos. Let's go get a W this week, Headliner Nation.
Analytics off the chain, all the channels not the same. Jake and Kyle, you know the name. Headliner Nation, we running the game.